go. Posing. Posing, posing.
Yeah, cool. Yeah.
But we're gonna shift over.
Hey everybody, we're gonna get started in just about 2 minutes. We'll try to start right on time. Valerie, I've just unmuted you, and so you'll be able to talk. We'll have a little bit of introductions here, but you can go ahead and share your presentation whenever you're ready.
All right. There we go.
Great.
Have to share my screen now. One moment. There we are.
Okay. All right, so it being 12 o'clock, we'll go ahead and get started. We're going to be hearing from Valerie Langer today, but we'll introduce her in just a couple minutes. It is 12 o'clock. Thanks everyone for coming back and for joining us for our sixth episode of the webinar series that we've been doing. My name is Galen Armstrong. I'm Sierra Club BC's lead organizer, and I'm calling from Salt Spring Island today on the unceded territory of the Sinchothan and the Hulkaminam speaking peoples primarily. I see that there are a couple people in Johnson's Landing, so hello to you. That is very cool. Good to see you. Most of you are pros on this program that we're using, Zoom, by now. So I'll just remind you that there is a chat box and you can post questions in there. There'll be a question and answer period towards the end, and we'll do our best to get around to everybody's questions. I was gone last week. I was up in the forest on Vancouver Island. John, thank you so much for hosting that webinar. I was up and around the area of the Sitka River. So it's up towards Port McNeill on Vancouver Island, around the Robson Bight. Really beautiful area. There was a provincial park created in the 90s, the Sitka River Provincial Park. Or lower Sitka rather, and the lower part is important because it's just the lower part of that river that was protected. The upper part of the Sitka is totally unprotected, and all the other creeks that are in there. So we were in and around Schmidt Creek, Adam and Eve Creek, Thursday Creek, all these beautiful valleys up and around the Sitka River. And we saw a lot of really horrible logging. So those of you who are on Facebook may have seen already some photos that I've posted. We were up there with a photographer named Louis Bachner and a videographer named Dan Pierce, and they both got some really amazing shots and footage. And so it'll take us a little bit of time to put those all together. We're working with Wilderness Committee. Torrance Cost was up there from Wilderness Committee. Mark Worthing was up there, my fellow campaigner here at Sierra Club BC. The two of them are actually up in that region again this week. So they're on their second week of the forest tour. So there will be much more to share. So look forward to obviously some terrible clear-cut photos, but also some really beautiful photos and video from forests that haven't been cut, some intact forests. I saw the biggest yellow cedars that I've ever seen in my life. It was really incredible. And so there are places there that BC Timber Sales plans to auction off in the next year or two. And so we're going to fight like hell to stop them from auctioning those bits off. They're logging old growth forest and hoping nobody notices. So our mission was to get up there and get footage from these places that most people don't have a chance to go and see themselves. So more on that later. For now, I'll hand it over to you, John, and you can give a few updates.
Great, thanks Galen. So I'm John, a volunteer with the Sierra Club BC and calling in from Victoria on unceded territories of the Lekwungen speaking peoples. We'd just like to thank everyone who's carried out the action from last week and has let us know that they'll be attending the June 6th Old Growth Day of Action. As a reminder, we're planning this province-wide day of action where the intention is for large or small numbers of people to show up at their local MLA's office demanding protection of old growth. We'd like people to turn up with signs. The more creative, the better. And at some offices, we'll see speakers address the crowd. So it should be a good atmosphere on the day and will be a great way of getting our voices heard. So if you haven't already, please let Galen or me know about which MLA's office you'll be heading to. So far, we're aware of events in Victoria, Courtenay, on the Sunshine Coast, and in Grand Forks. And there are murmurs of events elsewhere like Vancouver and the Lower Mainland. We'd also like to thank those who have been active in the Facebook group, including the sharing of a few more letters that went out to Doug Donaldson last week, a local petition, as well as some inspiring quotes and information. So thanks all for sharing those things. And don't forget, if you have any questions or talking points that come to mind after today's webinar, then the Facebook group is the place for these. So Galen, that's all from me. I'll now hand back to you.
So thanks, John. We're also joined again by Sierra Club BC's Senior Forest and Climate Campaigner, Jens Wieding. So he'll be available towards the end of the webinar today to help answer any questions that are specific to our campaigns that I can't answer. Without further ado, we'd like to introduce our guest speaker for the week, Valerie Langer. Valerie is a Fibre Solutions Specialist at Canopy. Valerie's been engaged in forest conservation campaigns for over 20 years, working as a forest campaigner for the Friends of Clayoquot Sound from 1988 to 2004, and taking part in the collaborative process that developed ecosystem-based management in the Great Bear Rainforest, which Sierra Club BC also worked on with Jens Wieding. Today, Valerie is going to be focusing on accelerating next generation solutions, which includes the use of agricultural residues such as wheat straw to make commercial paper, and use of recycled clothing to make new rayon as an alternative to using primary forests for pulp and paper textiles. I'm looking forward to this talk, and I've never met you, I don't think, Valerie, but I've heard a lot about you. You're a legend in the environmental movement here in BC, so thanks so much for spending some time with us today.
Great. Well, thanks a lot, Galen, and to the Sierra Club for organizing this series. I'm going to, in the interest of time, just leap in to the topic at hand. And I am working as a Fibre Solutions strategist right now with Canopy. But as Galen said, I've worked on old growth forest conservation campaigns for the better part of 30 years now in British Columbia. And as what I would like to do before I talk about alternatives to paper, not to using wood for paper, is to talk about the context in which campaigns like next generation fiber solutions can exist. Because there's a lot of good ideas out there in the world, and you might wonder why the good ideas don't make it through to being implemented, and that's because it takes more than just a good idea to get traction. In the world that we live in, it's not always the best idea that wins. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the context. Let me just go there right now. And what you're going to see on the screen, if I am able to actually advance my screen here. Galen, I'm having a little bit of trouble already. I can't seem to advance my screen. Oh, there we go.
Oh,
made it. Okay.
Perfect.
You see that?
Yeah, we can see
Right.
It. Looks great.
Great. It looks like spaghetti was thrown against the wall, or maybe an environmentalist version of a Jackson Pollock painting. But this is a way to think about a campaign's context and what the various opportunities are to leverage change. And I'm obsessed with leverage. I don't like to work on campaigns unless I have a sense of how I can gain a little bit of power in order to influence a decision, what decisions are made about land use. And this slide is a visualization. It's called a systems loop, and it indicates for you what campaigners tend to think about. So at the center, you see that the oval that says resource extraction and conservation standards. That's what's at play. And traditionally, the groups that have had real power, which I'm indicating through those black arrows, have been governments and the corporations that have tenure on the land base in British Columbia. So they have made decisions between themselves about what level of resource extraction will happen and where conservation will be allowed and what level of standards of performance or practice, forest practices are allowed. And that's been a very tight kind of power structure for many decades. It still exists, and but it's starting to change, in particular because First Nations have been able to, over a period of decades, leverage their legal rights and title, and in places like the Great Bear Rainforest and Clayoquot Sound, increasingly have been able to utilize the legal power that they've gained through tests in the courts and precedent-setting court cases. There's also been if you look over to the left-hand side of the screen, you'll see a box that says ENGOs, those are environmental organizations, and an arrow leading out to something called public narrative. So as you heard, Galen said when he opened the meeting, he talks about whose territory we were on. That was kind of wouldn't have been thought of as an issue that had to be raised at all. As little as 5 years ago, it was not a regular practice, and we can see the public narrative about First Nations rights and title changing. That gives a kind of added leverage to First Nations political leverage and decision-making leverage that they have in a very tight power system that has existed over the land base between government and the corporations who influence them. So what this systems loop here shows is the various ways in which we can choose to gather or pool our influence and then exert it as leverage into a power system in order to change it. To the left of the ENGOs box there, you'll also see something called market access campaigns. I'll be focusing more on one aspect of those campaigns, which Canopy is engaged in. You know them probably as the kinds of campaigns that the Friends of Clayoquot Sound, Greenpeace, Rainforest Action Network, Stand.Earth have run over the years to get companies to change their buying practices, and then those companies tell their suppliers, we won't buy from area X or area Y, and that gives the organizations influence over the corporations who have influence over government decision makers. Likewise, things like conservation financing, which was used in the Great Bear Rainforest, gives leverage to economic alternatives, and those economic alternatives then give First Nations a series of options within their own communities, so that they're not under as much pressure to take whatever jobs happen to be available in their region. They can make more choices about what kind of an economy they want to build. So those are the kinds of leverage opportunities that exist. Of course, we don't exist in a vacuum. All our campaigns have counterbalancing influencers on us. For example, labor and the logging contractors and many of the communities that are in areas of old growth forest have often been some of the greatest opposition, and they have great influence over government. They are voters in key sectors. So these are when you look at this diagram, it's a diagram that can help a campaigner make a decision about where they want to build their power to have influence over decision makers. Okay, so I'm going to do another seminar or webinar for Sierra Club BC series in a little while, in which I go deeper into campaigning skills, what I'll call campaigning 101. But this is kind of the baseline that you can start from. And now I'm going to shift to the way in which Canopy and several other organizations I mentioned have decided to utilize that market leverage. It's based on this idea or the theory of change that from the forest, the wood goes to a variety of logging companies and mills, and those logging companies sell huge volumes, millions of cubic meters per year to major corporate buyers, and then those corporate buyers turn those wood products into thousands and thousands of different products, from paper to wood to cellulosic products like acetate and viscose for textiles. And if any of you have ever tried to change, a parent or a teenager's mind about something, you'll find that even getting somebody who loves you to listen to you and change their behavior is very difficult. So it's quite difficult to get 7 billion individuals, consumers in the world, well, maybe even the 2 to 3 billion, which are the biggest consumers, to change their buying behaviors. The theory of change that if you can change those 1,000 corporate buyers in between the logging companies and the individual consumers, that you can then change what goes into the hands of the consumer. So if the 1,000 corporate buyers, and when I'm talking about corporate buyers, think of companies like Home Depot, Staples, H&M, Zara, who interact with millions upon millions of individual consumers. If they make a decision not to buy a forest product like packaging or 2x4s from a particular region, they can have enormous influence over the logging companies and the mills. And that can then leverage change back up in the forest. So I'm going to go into leapfrogging from this theory of change. Canopy has got now 750 major corporate buyers of paper and viscose rayon products to agree to eliminate ancient and endangered forests from their purchasing. And then when we say, okay, don't buy from over here, of course the companies say, well, where do we buy from instead? And this is where alternative fibers come into play, right? So first of all, the goal of having next generation solutions, we call them, or alternative fibers in the mix. So the goal is to take pressure off forests. We simply can't get all of the fiber that the world is demanding for all of the paper, all of the wood, all of the viscose and rayon from our forests without having a collapse of biodiversity worldwide, and a tremendous negative impact on the climate because of the carbon that's released from forests when they are logged. So we at Canopy have taken an approach of diversifying the feedstock, that is the base material that goes into manufacturing pulp. What are those base materials? Well, they're things like agricultural residues, so the straw that's left on the field after the harvest of wheat, flax, hemp, sorghum, bagasse, which comes from sugarcane. So after they squeeze the sugar out of the sugarcane, the leftover material is called bagasse. Banana, the banana plant, we call it a tree, but it's actually not a tree. It's a plant that every year has to be torn out and replanted. And the banana trunk makes good paper fiber, pineapple leaves, and there's dozens of other agricultural residues. On-purpose crops like bamboo that can be grown on degraded agricultural lands. Miscanthus grass, switchgrass, jute. These are very fibrous materials that can be planted on purpose. And then for making textiles such as rayon or lyocell, modal, these are all viscose-based textiles made from cellulosic fiber that is currently gathered by chopping down trees, chipping them, and pulping them in a highly toxic chemical pulping bath called dissolving pulp. And currently most viscose is made from dissolving pulp from forests like Indonesia. There was even a dissolving pulp mill on northern Vancouver Island until the Port Alice mill, until recently they shut down. And you can use recycled textiles collected from used clothing for remaking rayon or modal or tencel into, so you take old clothing and repulp it into a pulp for making thread, or microbial cellulose. This is the process where, for example, one company in Australia is growing cellulose on fermented food waste. So they gather food from whatever, a brewery or a tomato sauce manufacturer, and then they can ferment it and grow cellulose. So there are many, many options to old growth forests for making fibers. So if you take a look at what's happening in the world, this is where paper consumption and growth is happening. So there's a total of 411 million tons of paper that's produced in the world now. You can see the majority of that, about 40%, a little over 40% of that is container board. So that's like what we would call cardboard for shipping products back and forth across the ocean or in trucks from warehouses to retail stores. Then there's tissue, box board, wrapping papers, and other types of paper board. That's all the stuff on the right-hand side of the graph. The ones that are primarily in reduction worldwide, you can see that newsprint is just almost, it's just in a free fall. Hardly anybody's reading newspapers in hand. They read it online now. And also various kinds of copy and writing paper are on the decrease. So we're focusing a lot on packaging for that reason. Although I have to say that even though there's a decrease in the total amount of writing and printing grade paper, it's still the second biggest use in the world, and it's very important that we continue to reduce and improve the ecological qualities of printing and writing grade papers. The reason that we're doing this work at looking at alternative fibers is because nature has thresholds beyond which you start to have an unraveling of ecosystems. A common one that you'll hear now is that nature needs half. And that's not just the poor scraps that are left over after industrial logging has happened. We actually need to have productive ecosystems, old growth forests, and in order to maintain the functions of forests that are of benefit to us, from rain to carbon storage and the carbon balance with the atmosphere, and water management, etc. Currently, there are 2.3 billion trees a year that are used to make packaging, and it's growing at a pace of about 3.5% per year. And if you look at the last decade, between 2010 and the projections for 2020, that viscose rayon production has nearly doubled in that decade. So, and it's continuing to grow. So we desperately need to consider how we insert alternatives into the mix, because we've been trying for a long time to get reduction, but we can't solve this problem only by asking companies who are bent on growth to reduce their growth. It's been a little bit of a failing approach for the last 20 years. So we have to start looking at how we keep or recuperate ecosystems at their health thresholds. One of the reasons that we're doing this also is because better forest management, if you do not reduce the total amount of trees that are used in these forest products, it doesn't matter if you're doing better forest management, you're still taking too much. There's just a threshold beyond a volume of forest that just cannot be logged. So that's what I call volume overshoot. There's a hierarchy to this. The first thing that we need to do is reduce use. And so that's the best thing that any company or human being can do for protection of forests, reduce the use of forest products. The next best thing is to use recycled fiber, whether that is for paper or whether that is for, using recycled textile fiber for making new viscose or rayon or acetate. Okay, so you can take cotton clothing and repulp it and then produce rayon, because cotton is a cellulosic fiber. I hope you can ask me questions about this later if I'm going a little bit too quickly. Okay. Then the third point on the hierarchy is agricultural residue. So agricultural residue is a very good option to virgin forest fiber, but it's not as good as recycled. Agriculture, of course, has an impact on the environment. It's not without its own problems. So we have to be very careful that we're not shifting the problem from the forest to degradation of soils in agricultural lands. So only a portion of the agricultural residue that is left after the crop harvest should be used. Otherwise, an agricultural fiber paper or textile would be unsustainable as well. It would be contributing to soils giving off more carbon or inability to store carbon. So there are sustainable parameters for agricultural fibers as a feedstock as well. And then the next best after that on the hierarchy is Forest Stewardship Council certified planted forest fiber. So this would be, for example, a second growth forest that was planted in an area that had already been logged, but the management of that forest is to a high standard, where areas are kept aside for habitat. A reduction in the total amount of logging happens in order to maintain carbon benefits and water quality, etc. And First Nations free, prior, and informed consent is part of the process that the company has to go through to get the rights to log. Right? So that's the hierarchy. First thing, reduce. Second, use recycled fibers. Third, use agricultural residues within sustainable boundaries. And then if you still need to have virgin fiber, use FSC certified planted forest fiber. That's what we're aiming for. And the reason for doing this is because, as I said, if you can log too much of anything. You can overuse any resource, even agricultural fiber. So if you look at the pie on the left and consider that we would like to see 50% of all paper and textiles be made with recycled fiber, and then let's say 30% is used using agricultural fiber, and then there's Forest Stewardship Council virgin for 20%. If the pie is too big, it's still too much forest that's going to be used. So reduction makes all of the solutions viable. That's the context, and that means that we have to consistently work within a context of other campaigns in collaboration with other organizations that are working outside of the feedstock issue to make sure that forests on the ground are getting protected and the total volume of what is logged is reduced. I'm going to show you this great graph from Kimberly-Clark. Now, Kimberly-Clark is one of the biggest tissue and paper producers in the world. They're a huge industrial company with operations in countries around the world, a dozen or more countries around the world. They made a commitment to eliminate endangered forests from their supply chain and maximize the alternatives. So they decided to take a look at, what is the performance of various kinds of fibers. And if you do a quick look at this graph, you'll see that recycled paper, and this was just for paper, recycled paper performs the best ecologically. It is by far the superior performance ecologically. And then you have a couple of other types of agricultural fibers and wood fiber. Look over to the left and you'll see northern softwood. That's northern softwood are the trees that are logged across Canada, right? BC, Alberta, so this is pine, fir, hemlock, cedar, those are all softwoods. And then on the right, far right, you see a type of plant called Canopy. Not all agricultural fibers or plant fibers are necessarily optimal. So it's really important that we do this kind of science so that we're making informed choices about what kind of agricultural fiber will be utilized for making the next generation of paper. And you can see that wheat straw, which is a residue, is really quite a low footprint compared to northern softwood or even bamboo. And the issue that is worse is the human toxicity. So this is pesticide use. So if we're to shift to organic wheat straw farming or reduced pesticide use, there you go. Wheat straw becomes an even better source of fiber for making paper. So who are some of the innovators in the world right now? This is certainly not a comprehensive list. We're working currently with over a dozen companies around the world who have figured out how to new technologies for making what were traditionally wood-based products using either agricultural fibers or recycled cotton. There's Columbia Pulp, which is the first wheat straw pulp mill to be built in North America since the 1960s. They're based out of Southeast Washington State. Evernew is a tech company that has developed a process to turn cotton garments, so used cotton, so like particularly looking at jeans, so they collect denim and they can repulp denim or any kind of cotton into a new cellulosic pulp for making rayon or lyocell or tencel. Titan Biosciences has a different technology that can separate with using only water. They can separate cotton from polyester blended, which is a lot of our clothing is cotton poly blend. So they figured out a technology to separate it out, and you end up with cotton that can be reused and turned into rayon, and polyester, which can be recycled into polyester thread. Renewcell is a Swedish company that already has a 7,000 ton per year cellulosic fiber pulp mill. They have a partnership with H&M, which is one of Canopy's partners, eliminating ancient and endangered forests from their supply chain. So H&M is increasingly buying pulp from Renewcell, which is made from when these H&M stores are now collecting used clothing from their customers and then sending that clothing to their industry technology partner, Renewcell, to be repulped into rayon pulp. And then a company called Circular Systems, which is an American-Canadian company that uses either used textiles or agricultural fibers in what's called a biorefinery, where they can make new pulp for textiles or for paper, and they can have a smaller biorefinery, so it can be rather than have a large mill, small mills that can be situated very close to farms. Those are some of the innovators. I'm going to give you an example of Columbia Pulp, which is going to be opening this summer. They're the first wheat straw pulp mill. The benefits of Columbia Pulp are that instead of using 50,000 plus trees a year to make about 150,000 tons of pulp for paper, they're using wheat straw that would otherwise be burned. The burning of wheat straw, if it was not being utilized in the mill, would create 18,000 tons per year of greenhouse gas emissions from field burning, which is a common practice in high-density wheat straw or high-density farm regions where there's too much straw to plow back into the soil. So they're going to be eliminating at least 18,000 tons a year of GHG emissions from field burning. They only use 5% of the straw biomass in a 100-mile radius around the mill. They're using lower chemical consumption, so much greener chemistry than a conventional kraft paper mill. They use about 15% of the total water of a similar size kraft paper mill that would be using wood, and about 60% of the total energy use of a similar size kraft mill. So tremendous environmental benefit. Columbia Pulp didn't even need to get a pollution permit from the state of Washington to build their industrial scale mill in Washington. Why? Because they're not producing water pollution or air pollution. The byproducts of the mill are sugar, C3 sugar polymers that can be utilized by other industries for making things like bioplastics, for example. The social benefits of Columbia Pulp, well, they're going to be employing 85 people at the mill in an economically depressed farm region of the United States. There will be 200 jobs servicing the mill, also from the region. And the farmers are getting revenue selling the straw byproduct that they would otherwise have to pay money to burn. So those are the kinds of benefits that we're looking at. It's a good news story. It's going to be, this company is a pioneer in the United States, but we think that once they are up and running, that there will be many more mills that will be following suit. It's always hard being first. Everybody says they want to be innovators, but actually very few really want to be first. Most people want to be second. Let somebody else take the risk.
Valerie, it's Galen. I just want to give you a time check. It's 12:36. Just want to make sure we have time for questions before the end of the hour.
Right. Okay. So I'm almost done. I'll just to say this, that building new infrastructure for this kind of transformation is really expensive. It would take about 200 more mills to produce the amount of agricultural fiber and recycled textile, cellulosic fiber, to really help to reduce the total amount of ancient and endangered forest that is currently being lost worldwide. That means we are going to have to pursue about $40 billion in investments, and there's going to have to be support in the marketplace. One of the things that we need to have is governments incentivizing this kind of support for infrastructure change. It's been a long haul, but we're starting to see that kind of support coming around. And the truth of the matter is that we already did several tests with this kind of pulp. We did Alice Munro's, Margaret Atwood, and Jan Martel, all three authors, allowed us to do test runs of their books using wheat straw fiber, and it worked perfectly on the presses. So there you go. These are the options that we've got before us, and the challenge that we have ahead in order to build literally hundreds of new mills that will use alternative fiber feedstock to wood in the next decade. So some time for questions if you have them. Would it be best if I stop sharing my screen, or what would you like?
That would be great if you can stop sharing, and then we'll just see your video. Thank you so much, Valerie. That was great to hear, and really cool to think about the massive scale that you're talking about and the type of change that's happening and can happen. So we do have some questions here, and I'm gonna pull one from the chat. There's one here from Meadow, and she says, or they say, as a farmer, the use of straw for paper concerns me. Straw is already more expensive than hay. Also, for soil health, straw should be replaced into the soil rather than removed for human use, even in the form of paper, and with the good intention of reducing tree harvest. So, do you want to respond to that?
I can address it. Sure. We're not advocating certainly for all straw to be removed, and we are not advocating for straw to be removed from areas where it would cause soil degradation. So we're looking at places where, because there's been a shift to no-till methods in order to maintain soil quality, the high density, we're in an industrial context. There is industrial farming that's happening, and burning of straw is also very negative in environmentally in many regions. So in areas where farmers are removing straw because they can't actually use it in the soil because it causes molding. There are areas in eastern Washington state, Idaho, Kansas, and Nebraska. Flax is burned across Manitoba and Saskatchewan. That's the agricultural fiber that we're looking at. And this is a global issue. So we're also looking at places like where banana plantations, pineapple plantations, and other kinds of industrial farming are happening. In the best world, we would shift everything so we're not using as much paper, we don't have industrial agriculture. I mean, we can envision our better world, but we're moving towards those in positive increments. And when we talk about climate and forests, we have really about another decade to 15 years, and we have to make use of some of these materials in the interim while we get to reductions, which we're quite sure we can institute, particularly in packaging.
Great. Thanks, Valerie, and thanks to Meadow for the question.
I appreciate the question. It's a very important issue because like I said, too much of anything is unsustainable, right? So if we just shift the problem onto agricultural lands, we're not really doing ourselves a benefit.
Absolutely. John, is there another question that you'd like to bring up here?
Yeah, so there's one here from Jens. He's just asking whether market work can be as effective in forest campaigns today as in the 1990s, considering global trends like huge numbers of consumers in China and India, etc.
Oh, absolutely. In fact, I would say that we've had more traction on the fashion campaign in a shorter period of time because environmental groups have refined the way that they do market campaigns. We've learned a lot since the 1990s. Market campaigns started out being a very blunt tool, and they've been very much refined. It's difficult to get into China, certainly, and they're a huge consumer. However, in packaging, most of the paper that goes into packaging in China is being utilized to ship product to Europe and North America. And so European and North American companies, consumers like H&M, like Staples, all of these major companies can influence their manufacturers in China to improve the ecological characteristics of the packaging that they use. They can make it a criteria. That is exactly why alternative fibers for viscose are now getting uptake in the fashion industry, is because the fashion industry influenced their Chinese and Indian manufacturers and vendors. So yes, it's a very useful campaign, continues to be. In part because the brands themselves, they're not the ones who log, but they can have influence down the supply chain, and they are very sensitive to their customers. So there is a role of the customer, of the consumer. The more that you articulate as a consumer to whomever you buy anything from, that you want them to use environmentally preferable materials, the better the market campaign will work.
Great, thanks, Valerie. There are a couple of questions from someone named Emery. So Emery, I'm going to attempt to unmute you and go. And I think you're unmuted now. So if you could just pick one of those questions to ask Valerie, go ahead.
Oh, okay, cool. Thank you very much, Valerie. That was awesome.
Thank you.
I'm just going to scroll up to my first question because you talked about harvesting overshoot, which I think is going to be a big part of the problem here in BC as we try and scale back old growth logging. And so I wanted to know if Canopy or anyone else you've been working with has kind of crunched the numbers on the scale of overshoot in British Columbia and on Vancouver Island, and how much smaller a kind of a sustainable annual allowable cut would be under a kind of FSC scenario.
Right, and Jens, you will know something about this too, but several years ago, an alliance of organizations, Jens, can you help me on remembering the name of the report that was written by Jim Pojar and Bryony Penn?
And Jens, I've just unmuted you too.
Sure, that's a new climate for conservation. Yeah. Jim Pojar's
that's right.
report. Yeah.
Yes. And that report, you can probably still access it somewhere online, outlines the, it reinforces, using best available, a literature review. Jim Pojar and Bryony looked at what does the best literature on this issue say, and it reinforced the idea that nature needs half, even in British Columbia. So the annual cut would have to be reduced to reflect the range of natural variation of types of forest, and make sure that half of them were protected. My expectation is that would likely reduce the cut in British Columbia somewhere between 30 and 50%. So we don't have the exact numbers, but it would be a rather dramatic reduction.
And looking at Vancouver Island, we have logged so much old growth that from a conservation perspective, we would have to move to 0 hectares of old growth logging in the short term. The reality is more complex. The reality is that some kind of phase out plan or transition would be needed to address the job challenge. But in terms of thresholds for ecological integrity, we are already deep into an ecological emergency, and it would require years or decades to allow some of the forests to recover and restore old growth features. So it's clearly very, very challenging because the governments have waited for too long, and now we are deep in the hole.
Right.
Thanks, Jens and Valerie. John, would you like to bring up another question?
Yeah, so this one's from Brad Wellman, and it's noting that in the late in the late 90s, at the Coastal Rainforest Coalition meeting, an expert on fibre said it always comes down to the cost of the commodity. How do we overcome the cheap subsidized cost of wood fibre?
It's just like the oil industry, that if governments weren't willing to subsidize them so much, all of the alternatives would already be on the market because they would be competitive. Like the way that solar, it took so long for the technology for solar and wind to be cheaper than producing power from coal. But if you took the subsidies away from coal or oil, it would have been a decade earlier that it would have been competitive. So this is really, I would say, an issue of the electorate, that as long as you have major corporate sectors that have so much influence over governments, that unless those governments are really see a clear pathway for themselves where, 1, they don't lose jobs, 2, they don't lose votes, and 3, they can see the way in which they can recapture their tax base or royalties base, then it's very difficult. And of course, then there's just the ideology. Innovation usually takes a long time to take hold, and then once it does, it takes off like a shot. So it's kind of the cross to bear of the environmentalists or the activists is that we see very little change, or things just seem to change at a very, very slow pace. But then when they do, they seem to change quite quickly. But there is no guarantee that things change in the time that we need them to. This is obviously it's kind of a life and death battle for the planet, and I don't have a silver bullet for you. Everything that everybody is doing now is what needs to be done. It's whether it will take hold in time. And I'm the optimist that we can't give up, and that we just have to keep working at government to stop subsidizing the negative and start incentivizing the positive. However, I will say that something like an agricultural fiber pulp or recycled textile pulp, if they can be produced for a lower price, then it enters itself into the market. It's just more difficult for a more expensive, old growth pulp to compete with a less expensive, similarly performing, ecologically preferable pulp. Right.
Thanks, Valerie. I'm an optimist too. We've got, I think, time enough for just one more question. It doesn't look like we'll be able to get to them all. So Jennifer, I'm going to unmute you now so you can ask your question.
Okay, I gotta read my question. I forgot exactly what I said here. Gotta go back and look at it. Okay, so any suggestions for how a citizens group can you hear me?
Yep, go ahead.
Any suggestions for how a citizens group in a sawmill town can help our local economy move in the direction of alternative pulp? There's clearly, I'm sure you know about this, there's resistance from locals and from the provincial government. So where do we start? What kind of activities should we be focused on?
Right. Well, and you may not be the place where your mill town is located may not be the best place for an alternative pulp, right? Because you don't want to be shipping a lightweight material like straw, hundreds of miles to where a sawmill was built near a forest, and you don't want to necessarily ship used textiles from Los Angeles all the way up to Vancouver Island either. So we might not be the location for the alternatives to build. However, when you take a look at the trajectory of jobs in mill towns in British Columbia, it's about 50% less. So the amount of wood cut has continued to be about stable. And the number of jobs per 1,000 cubic meters has been reduced by half. So currently, British Columbia is one of the lowest jobs per cubic meter cut regions in Canada, and certainly much lower than our neighbor in Washington State. As a person living in a town where people are resistant because they're scared that even the minimal jobs that are left will be lost, the avenue to go is to look at how could we shift to doubling the number of jobs per 1,000 cubic meters cut in order that we are at least on par. And it's like, what are we, chopped liver? Why shouldn't British Columbia get at least as many jobs per 1,000 cubic meters cut as they do in Washington State or in Quebec or in Ontario? And so if you can create within the community a sense that that is the goal, and that then you can say we could reduce the logging by 50% in our region if we could increase the number of jobs per 1,000 cubic meter cut to double. In fact, we would have a net improvement for our community. So that gets you into a conversation locally about what kinds of value-added products would you like to make, what kind of investment can it take, and you start formulating the plans that helps your community be more stable and have more equity with other regions that also have forestry in them in other parts of Canada. It's talking about equity and fairness and value. And I think that that's the way that we have to start shifting the dialogue within the sawmill communities, because it's no wonder people are scared. We get 0.8 jobs per 1,000 cubic meters cut in British Columbia. In Ontario, they get 4 jobs per 1,000 cubic meters cut, 4 times as many as we do in British Columbia. And in Quebec, they get 2 jobs for every 1,000 cubic meters cut. It's possible within a Canadian context, with high labor markets, etc., high-cost labor markets, which is often the excuse of the sawmills. It's possible in other regions to get more value for every piece of wood cut, and we should be doing the same.
Agreed. Thank you. Thanks for the question, Jennifer, and thanks so much, Valerie, for your time today. Do you have any
Thank you.
final words before we have an announcement from our communications manager? Any final thoughts before we go?
No, just thank you very much for the opportunity, and I look forward to an opportunity at a later date of doing a campaigning 101 for the Sierra Club series.
Absolutely, we'll get that scheduled. Thanks so much.
Great, great.
So I mentioned we're going to have an announcement from our manager of communications, Kat Zimmer, and she's going to provide some information on the podcast. I also just want to mention, remind everyone that we've got June 6th day of action happening around the province. This week's action is just to get to work organizing your day of action on June 6th. If you have a Facebook event, send me the link. If you have questions, get in touch. You can also keep the conversation going on our Sierra Club BC Volunteers Facebook group. So I'll pass it over to Kat, our manager of communications, just as soon as I can unmute her. Okay, go ahead, Kat.
Hi, Galen. Can you hear me?
Totally. Go for it.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Galen. And thanks, Valerie. That was really awesome. Hi, everyone. So I just want to let you know about our podcast if you haven't heard of it already. So it's actually returning next Tuesday with our latest mini-series. We had a mini-series that we produced last year that was all about solutions that are part of the clean energy transition. And so this Tuesday, we are relaunching with a new mini-series that is, there's going to be 9 episodes, and it's called Mission Transition, Clean Energy and Beyond. So there's going to be lots of amazing guests. We've interviewed journalists, some politicians, like activists, academics, lots of people on the ground, asking questions like what is clean energy and who should pay for the transition. We're going to be talking about the Green New Deal for Canada, which is a big thing that a lot of folks have been curious and excited about lately. So, and we also went up to Haida Gwaii, where they have a goal to move from diesel to 100% renewable, I think in the next 5 years. So we're sharing that story as well. So the podcast is hosted by Susan Elrington, who's a former CBC journalist, award-winning journalist. She's a real talent, along with our campaigns director, Caitlin Vernon. And so Mission Transition, it's going to be available. It's already available, actually, on Google Play, Apple Podcasts, anywhere that people get your podcasts. You can find it, and you can subscribe to it for free anywhere, including sierraclub.bc.ca/podcast. So you can subscribe to it right now. You can even binge listen to all of our previous season 1 episodes. They're just as relevant and interesting as they were when we released them. And then, as I said, the first episode of season 2 drops on Tuesday, May 21st. So I hope you'll all listen in. I think you'll really enjoy it. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Kat. As someone who listens to a lot of podcasts, I love the Sierra Club BC podcast. It's really good. So I'm looking forward to season 2. We have another exciting talk on the webinar series lined up for next week. We're going to be joined by Dr. Judith Sayers. She's a member of the Hupakaseth First Nation, and she's a mother of 2. She's the president of the New Chalmouth Tribal Council. She's a strategic advisor with Sayers Strategic Advice, and she's the former chief of the Hupakaseth First Nation. If you've enjoyed participating in this webinar series, we invite you to become a sustaining member by making a monthly donation to Sierra Club BC. If you donate $25 or more, you'll receive a Sierra Club BC t-shirt in the mail. And it's been really fun hosting another session this week. Thanks to all of you. Thanks to Kat and Jens and John, Henry, and especially to Valerie for her talk this week. Thanks again. We'll see you all next week.